A lot of people imagine what it would be like to have no conflict and live their lives conflict-free. I think the thing to know is that's probably not reality when you're dealing with humans, at least in the current culture, the current cultural structure. It's just the nature of dealing with other human beings. So the idea is not necessarily that you get rid of it, but how do you manage it? How do you do it in a way that is going to be beneficial for you? So let's start off with a couple of things. We're going to start by looking at what conflict is, and then looking at conflict in relationships just in general terms. What's conflict? There's 4 features that define it initially, and the first one is that, first of all, it deals with a person's perception, the belief and how a person might view things as far as a person's situation. What we oftentimes see is that somebody else's situation might be incompatible with what we would like to do, our goals and our actions that we would like to follow through with. So sometimes you'll have that, and oftentimes the perception's incorrect, or what you might do is you might find a way to create a situation that's win-win. A lot of times in conflict, people are looking for I win and you lose, but there are oftentimes ways to come up with situations where both people win, or there's a little give and take on both sides. We'll talk more about that in a little bit, but the idea is we start off with the belief that somebody else is opposed to or standing in the way of us achieving our goals. So that's kind of the heart of this. If there's conflict or clashes between goals or behaviors, and again, I can go back to perception, but if we believe that somebody else is in our way of achieving what we want to achieve, then we're going to run into problems. Now, this happens through a process, so it's not necessarily that it happens one time, but a lot of times this happens through time. So these are goals and things that happen in stages, in steps, and there's kind of consequences for those things. So if we don't do a good job of handling our conflicts, then there can be repercussions long term. So if we're going to be in relationship with somebody for a longer period of time, then us not handling that probably isn't going to be beneficial to you. Relationships are dynamic, meaning that they're constantly changing. There's a shift in focus, and we want to kind of pay attention to what's happening in that over time. This idea of kitchen sinking, my students really seem to like this and kind of attach themselves to it, but I think it's something that's we can kind of identify as being real, and it's when somebody brings in a bunch of other stuff. So you are having an argument with somebody, and the next thing you know, you're talking about something that happened 10 years ago, and it has absolutely nothing to do with what you're currently discussing, but for some reason it's come up in this argument. Yeah, but I remember 10 years ago when this and this happened. And they're like, 10 years ago? What does it have to do with what's happening here? It's just a natural thing that we seem to do in our conflict, and we're throwing stuff up that has nothing to do with that. So I think when someone says, well, what does that have to do with our argument? I think that's a valid question. Yeah, but it relates back because this and this happened. Probably not the healthiest way of dealing with an argument if you're continuing to bring back up stuff that was left over from a previous argument, or at least make sure you deal with it as much as you can. And if it doesn't belong in this argument, then maybe you make decisions or have a conversation about that. Of course, probably not while you're in the heat of the argument. Probably not going to help. So we looked at conflict and relationships, and one of the things that we can look at is common issues that sort of relate to that. So one of the common issues is just a person has irritating behaviors. I think about that from I have a brother, an older brother, and I remember him just beating the snot out of me when I was a kid. And then I remember years later looking back and seeing these kids and this little girl with her older brother, and she was just being super annoying. And I thought, oh my God, that was me. No wonder my brother was irritated because I was just being a brat. And yeah, I don't think you see it necessarily when you're in the middle of it, but yeah, irritating behaviors, I think it shows up a lot in families with siblings in particular. This idea of relationship rules, and again, if you, when you're getting into a relationship with somebody, you have to create kind of your own family rules and decide what those rules are going to be. And there's always going to be interesting things that happen if you get into a relationship with someone that didn't grow up exactly like you did, because they're going to have different ways of doing things. And what's the right way and what's the wrong way? And is there a right and wrong way? And what do you guys decide that you would like to do for those kinds of elements? So, you've got the relationship rules that you grew up with and the relationship rules that you developed, but now you have to decide what the relationships rules are between you and your significant other. And there's always personality clashes. There's people that maybe don't, you know, maybe you have one person that is super organized and has everything in its place, and then you have the next person that doesn't really care about all that stuff and it's just not important to them, and they end up being roommates together in college or something, and then they have a hard time figuring out what to do. They have a hard time, developing the kind of a blend with each other. So we look at those ideas and how we might manage conflicts, and there's kind of a guarantee that you're gonna have a little emotional stuff going on there. It's gonna have some oomph behind it, a little bit of power behind it when you have an argument with somebody else. But you have to keep in mind that those relationships and those conflicts are going to impact what's going to happen with your relationship in the future. So what does that look like? And there are things that you can say. I think that it's coming up and it talks about sudden death statements. You got to be kind of keeping in track. If you want to keep this relationship, maybe keep those things in mind when you're having an argument. How do you figure those things out? What's going to be your process? Because this stuff's going to impact what's going to happen with your relationships in the future. There you go. Just to start off with this chapter on conflict resolution.